Okay. And there we go. Okay. So we're just going to go for it. And then also, I just wanted to say also, if you like need a break or a bathroom or a sneeze or cough or anything, I edit everything. So, yeah. Yeah, I'm not the most advanced pro editor, but I do my best. So we can take out those little things. All right. So I do your bio and your intro after we record the episode. So I give a little intro into the talk. So we'll just kick off. And I'll start by welcoming you to a Curious Yogi podcast. Sheena, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this podcast. I'm excited to chat with you today, Bobby.
Yeah, I'm really excited to chat with you also. Like I just mentioned, I've been reading a lot of your work and seeing what you're up to. And I was already following Yogis for Palestine, and I had heard about you already from Tejal from ABCD Yogi. And yeah, I'm just really excited to talk with you. I think you have so much knowledge on so many levels that is going to enlighten me hopefully a little bit, and I hope the listeners as well. So yeah, and I will give an intro, a full intro later, as I mentioned, but I just want to start by just like touching on a few high level points here. You're an assistant professor of sociology, an activist, a yoga practitioner, and I love this, healing justice visionary. That is amazing. And I want to just start, like I usually love to just hear kind of the guest's backstory. And I did read an article that you wrote, I believe it was for Race and Yoga Journal, called A Yogini's Journey Disrupting White Supremacy, Hindu Fundamentalism, and Casteism. And the first sentence of this article that you wrote, I guess, would I call it an article?
Yeah, sure. I'm trying to remember what the first sentence is.
Yeah. Yeah, anytime like you read something back that someone said, it's like, wow. But no, this is how you started it. It's so powerful. You said, as a South Asian femme with Hindu roots, my journey in practicing and offering yoga has been ancestral, healing, restorative, and enlightening. It has also been complicated, contradictory, and heartbreaking. So I thought we could start there.
Yeah. How do I answer this in I'm gonna try and keep it short, right? And I appreciate you pointing me back to that because I feel like so much of my journey of connecting yoga to my politics kind of starts there, right? Um, I was first brought into yoga through my grandparents, right? Through mainly my paternal grandmother when I would visit her in India. Her name is Kailash Parvati Sood, or Kailash Sood, rather. And she would teach me mantras, right? She would teach me japa mantras and what we might call Hindu shlokas or prayers, right? And I think, often we associate mantras as a way of practicing bhakti yoga, right? Or devotional yoga in mainstream understandings of yoga philosophy. And I did feel like, a lot of her teachings really brought me a sense of peace. They brought me a sense of connection to breath. While I was in college, I was continuing a little bit of the practices she would teach me. And that's when I kind of started practicing with the Art of Living Foundation, right? As maybe many of us in the yoga world have heard about, perhaps. It was started by Sri Ravi Shankar, not to be confused with the sitar player. And I I kind of immediately found a sense of belonging in these communities, right? Where I was learning breath practices, I was learning like Sudarshan Kriya, which was like a kind of particular breath practice that Ravi Shankar developed, right? Sri Ravi Shankar developed. Uh, and and I felt like I was connecting to my roots, right? In this very much white supremacist kind of context of living in the South of Georgia, right? Or living in the South of the United States, but in this context of kind of also realizing my brown body in this context and coming into my own politicization. And and I think that's where I think about, when you say like my journey into yoga has been ancestral, it has been really a reclamation in ways. But I think when we talk about the heartbreak and when we talk about the complicated journey, uh, I came into that when I started learning about things like the caste system, right? And how, my parents and my grandparents, they didn't really talk about caste growing up. We didn't talk about caste growing up. It was kind of like, you're in America now. That was a thing from the past. India doesn't practice it anymore. And I know you mentioned, you've been to India, and the caste system has been legally abolished in the Constitution, but it is very much still alive and living within the socio kind of religious hierarchy of Indian society, right? And so it was kind of when I was starting to really hear from people from um, oppressed caste communities, and when I started hearing from people in like Muslim communities, where I was kind of asked to confront all of these kind of spiritual philosophies that I was learning, such as yoga, and really realizing that yoga too is tainted, right? Yoga too came out of an environment and a political context and a social context, like any cultural practice. Yoga came out of this context that is kind of embedded in caste hierarchy. It's embedded in the reality of what's going on in India today around uh, the political environment and the persecution of Muslims and the persecution of Christian minorities and Sikh minorities and Dalit and oppressed caste people, right? As we see kind of happening, through the Modi um, prime minister kind of role and throughout the government. And it's also where I started learning about the complicity of gurus that I once revered, such as Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, right? And and that is kind of, like hearing a little bit about his complicity and his endorsement of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, even after Prime Minister Narendra Modi was complicit in the pogroms that he participated in, where 2,000 plus Muslims died in the Gujarat riots, right? Uh, as he was chief minister of the state of Gujarat. And I think kind of realizing that my spiritual leaders, right, people who I thought were enlightened, right, can also be complicit in perpetuating political violence. It, it was heartbreaking because I had to leave my yoga practice for several years. And I only came back into it when I could personally reckon with how can I do these practices for my body, and how can I do these practices of care for myself so that I can show up for my community, like in a way that allowed me to kind of make the philosophy and the practice feel meaningful for me and for the values that I hold around social justice. Was the only way I could kind of walk back into that practice. And it has to be, for me, through disrupting casteism and naming it as a part of yoga philosophy, and naming how Hindu fundamentalism, which is kind of Hindu nationalism, finds its way into yoga philosophy. And also, of course, talking about this context of Western white supremacy too, but also as a yogi who comes from an upper caste background and a Hindu background, really naming my own complicity and my ancestors being a part of both being persecuted by British colonialism, but also being participants in the oppression of lower caste. And other religious minorities in India and South Asia more greatly.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Wow. Wow, there's a lot there, like just kind of going through with you your expression about, when you said coming into these groups like the Art of Living Foundation, and you also wrote about being a part of, like, I think it was the Hindu Student Council, and then kind of recognizing your brown body, and also I'm sure like growing up in the American South, like as probably a very much visible minority, like that experience, like at what point in that part of your life did it go from just exploring the practices, learning more about your Hindu roots, to actually making this work, your life's work, moving into social justice, into activism in a very loud and big way, I'm sure on a personal level, but also on a professional level? Like, what was that? And when did that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you have me like turning wheels in my head because I see it as a continuum in so many ways. I moved to Philly, or what's also known as occupied Lanai Lenape Hokkien land, in 2010 to start my PhD program in sociology. And that's also when I started getting involved roughly with movements to free political prisoners. Uh, Usually in Philadelphia, that has meant uh, people who have been imprisoned for their involvement in Black Power movement struggles and Black liberation struggles from the 60s onward. Uh, and I distinctly remember the first time I really was able to start connecting yoga and a philosophy that's often preached within yoga circles around, yoga is about connecting us to freedom, but also to each other, right? Yoga is about our interconnected humanity. And noticing this, I was kind of both in this yoga circle. I had done my yoga teacher training in 2011 in India, and I came back, and of course really just wanted to share these practices with my immediate community, which was my political community in Philadelphia. And one of the first kind of programs that I remember creating with some community members was this program called Free Mumia, Free Them All. There was like another Free Your Mind, kind of like Free Your Mind, Free Mumia, Free Them All. Mumia is Abu Jamal is a political prisoner who's from Philadelphia. And it was an opportunity to get people practicing on the mat, but then also connecting their own humanity to the humanity of people who are locked up in this mass incarceration system, this criminal injustice system in the United States, right? And really thinking about the interconnected freedom we have if we have people who are locked up behind bars in a system that is making money off of their incarceration, then we have to think about our freedom as bound with each other, and our liberation, our struggle, and our need to fight for that liberation, and our breath, right, as something that is deeply connected to that. So like having us reflect on the mat as we're taking breaths, as we're embodying this practice of freedom, how can we think about people who are also behind bars? And so I remember that being like a distinct example in my head if I'm thinking about it. And then it kind of, I don't know, it just became really organic, right? It's just how it goes, in the sense of kind of realizing like, oh, my duty is to kind of simultaneously create a container for how this practice of embodiment can serve myself and my community so that I can continue to show up for political work, and also how we can continue to show up for political work, because otherwise burnout is so real on the other end as you're continuing to fight and struggle against this oppressive system and this living in this heart of empire, right? US empire and US imperial projects are so it's exhausting, right? It's exhausting to kind of think about all the brutality in the world and all the suffering in the world that is caused by my government, not to mention, like, um, kind of amidst the world of, kind of like oppression that we live in. And like, how can this be a container for us to be able to kind of resource ourselves? Um, and so yeah, it kind of, I wasn't studying that in grad school. I wasn't studying the politics of yoga in grad school, but then I started writing about it naturally. And I'll say one more thing. Um, you asked about how did this become my life's work, right? I can't remember if I've written about it anywhere, but one of my first experiences of thinking about the political weaponization of yoga, which I think is how it is that people might use yoga as a tool for oppression or to advance oppression or to advance a harmful agenda. One of my first experiences of that, when I look back, is when I went to India in 2011. And I went to McLeodganj thinking that my main struggle was going to be with confronting this neo-colonial reality of like, I'm a brown person trying to go back to my homeland and to practice yoga and to learn from a teacher who I actively sought out to be Indian or of South Asian descent. And I thought, my struggle is going to be around like, how do I confront the amount of like kind of consumption of spirituality that I'm going to encounter, right? Especially from European and white bodies. And and as much as that may have been a bit of a challenge, upon reflection, what I actually recognized to be the political weaponization of yoga was confronting and realizing, and right now we're living 10 and 11 months into this genocidal reality. But it was my first example of meeting uh, people who were coming out of the Israeli military and their compulsory military service. And they had set up, you know, little towns, which the locals referred to as Little Israel. In Dharamkot, in Kasol, they call it Mini Israel or Mini Tel Aviv or Tel Aviv of the Hills. And I was meeting people who, right after coming out of a military that is actively occupying and practicing military apartheid, you had soldiers coming out and doing yoga and meditation to relieve themselves, to decompress from their experiences in the military as soldiers, but who were not interrogating the fact that they were participating in an army that was actively ethnically cleansing Palestinian people. And to me, right, when I think about my work and my role and my purpose now, I think so much of the conversation on decolonizing yoga is about in the mainstream is about putting brown bodies or Black, brown, Indigenous bodies in mainstream yoga spaces. And while I don't necessarily think that's not important, I think, sure, I want yoga spaces to be diverse. I actually think what's more important when we think about, to me, decolonizing yoga is connecting yoga to an ethics of anti-imperialism where people are actually interrogating how yoga is being used as this military weapon by soldiers and by governments, and when we think about the Indian government, it's happening. They're teaching yoga to their soldiers. The Israeli government is teaching yoga to its soldiers. the US government is complicit in teaching yoga to its border security forces and to its policing agents. And to me, as a practitioner, when I think about decolonizing yoga, I think about what are the ethical implications of yoga being used by these racially oppressive colonial forces and being used to help people who are agents of that oppression feel better and
Mhm.
decompress and de-stress. And that to me is like what I think is a really important kind of message for me. When I think about like what is my role, what is my purpose, right? I for some reason I just am like I'm supposed to talk about this. Yeah. I'm supposed to
Mhm.
talk about this. And yeah, this is what I call omwashing.
Mhm. Yeah, it does bring up like such a kind of question, I think, for anybody that's listening, because it's like we see these practices presented in this way, in which, in like a capitalistic, you're saying, in an imperialistic society that's saying, like, here's yoga for all as this kind of way, like you said, of feeling better. And in some of your writings, you use this word like a few times, or this description of the liberatory potential of yoga, and that's something that, at least at that time in your writing, you mentioned a few times, and it really struck me because, and at the same time, it's like this dichotomy. It has this potential, and yet it's being weaponized or used in these oppressive groups now all over the world. Like, even in, the Omwashing article for Al Jazeera, where you're talking about how Modi is used yoga, like you said so clearly, to push forward the Hindu nationalism, and now it's everywhere you look. It's yoga is India's great gift to the world. And and in one way, like me, as someone that's benefiting off of the kind of back of that, as a privileged white woman, I can say, yeah, it is a gift to me. And then it's like, just your questions or your expression is like shifting the reflection to think like, okay, and it's being used to uplift those that are oppressing, when we all should be working, or must be working collectively, for the freedom of all, including the freedom of not just my own self from my own suffering. So my question for you then is it like, is there a way, an avenue, for these practices, for these teachings, to not uphold the oppressor, but rather to like awaken the oppressor, to kind of reconcile, so that, when I think of those Israeli soldiers coming into India, which I've also seen them, and a friend of mine is Israeli, and she went to India after her mandatory military service. She faked a mental illness so she could get out, and she went to India, and that's because everybody else that she knew went to India. And it's like, there a place, where is the place for the reconciliation, or is it there? It's like, it can the practice be for all? Like, I'm not really articulating my question clearly, but it's because it's not clear within myself. Like, because you're right, like 11 months in, like last November, I had a guest on my show, Ned Rose. She's a part of the Portland chapter of Jewish Voices for Peace. And I just like can't believe it's like a whole year later almost, and like this is still happening. So I think because it brings up confusion in myself. So there wasn't even a question there. That was just more of me like expressing, because what you're saying feels so important, but also so confusing.
Yeah. Thank you. I think there's a question in there for sure. And I appreciate like the humility of talking about the confusion, right? Like I think a lot of us are probably there. And And that's so honest and real. I mean, I think my short answer is yes, right? I remember my guru, um, who I practice within India, Yogi Shivadas, who I remember one of the things he said, right? And I don't necessarily stand by everything it is that he preached, but one thing he said was yoga is a practice of self-awareness, right? Yoga brings us into self-awareness. I think that the way yoga is couched right now in our neoliberal capitalist context, and in this context where, you know, we see the alliances of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva aligning with Zionism, which, you know, to me, Zionism is an ideology that has actively sought to create a Jewish ethno state, you know, which has meant safety for, in the context of Israel, safety for the settlers who have gone in and colonized and displaced and ethnically cleansed and wiped out Palestinians, right? It's not necessarily about just Jewish safety, it's about a Jewish ethno state and a theocracy. And it's aligning with, you know, the US white supremacy and, you know, capitalism. I think there's room for anyone, right, to use yoga as a practice of self-awareness, to be able to kind of say like, how can my practices of breath work and embodiment allow me to accept the contradictions of the world we are living in, a world that is deeply unfree, and recognize ways in which, you know, you had someone from JVP on who I'm guessing identifies as a yogi as well, but who's like, okay, I'm going to work with this practice and these revelations of self-awareness to try to build in whatever way I can a more free world, to call out the lies of the world and the world leaders, right? And I think, you know, even for someone who goes and practices, who's done harm, who's participated in oppression, right? I'm not anti, you know, anyone who's participated in the police or who's participated in the military doing yoga itself, but it's more so the way in which it's currently being used is often as a tool of spiritual bypass, is often as a tool of escapism, right? We saw it after October 7th when you know, the insane number of yoga studios that said, we condemn Hamas, we condemn these attacks, but they didn't recognize the context from which this resistant movement emerged. And and I think so often yoga is used as this tool of pray for peace and light. Let's remain neutral. Let's pray for both sides in this way that is not inviting us to be critically self-aware of our positionality and our location, as well as the reality of world history, which is a colonial and racially supremacist context. And so I do think when I say there's liberatory potential, I do believe that. I do believe these practices of self-awareness, meditation, yoga can bring us into deeper self-awareness of the world that we exist in, and even fuel us in ways when we take a moment and take a breath. It can fuel us to be able to show up with that honesty and to confront the contradictions more so than to escape them.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
When you're talking about spiritual bypassing, like I'd love if you would shed a little bit more light on that, because I think it's really important for us as individuals to contemplate it, as well as looking at it in the broader kind of yoga world, or kind of new age spirituality world, where it's all one, and that's like it is a beautiful kind of ideal at its essence, but in practicality, in daily activity, not only like on a yoga mat, but in lived reality, how often we maybe even unconsciously are spiritual bypassing. And can you just bring a little bit more light to that in terms of like having, like you said, the self-awareness about it, maybe even where we don't even know like how to look, how to, because I think for me anyways, as a yoga practitioner and someone that's trying to work for my own freedom and hopefully the freedom of others through my action, like where my blind spots are. Like I don't know what I don't know. So how can we be aware of that?
Hmm. I think, yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think what's dancing in my head, I hope it comes out in an articulate way, is, I think so often we're taught in maybe mainstream yoga spaces that yoga's not political, or that leave the politics behind. Yoga's about oneness. Let's just come together and do this practice. And uh everyone has breath, and like I don't see race, and I don't see these hierarchies is kind of the language that might be used if we're participating in spiritual bypass. And I do believe there's a core humanity to us all, and a core connection that we have as human beings to us all. And uh I believe that. And at the same time, right, I do believe that everything is and has political implications, right? Which is why either I say yoga is neutral in the sense that yoga can be used for weaponization or yoga can be used for liberation, or I say that yoga is inherently uh contradictory, or like it's been weaponized, right? It was weaponized by Brahmins, the most upper caste, against lower caste people historically. And I think I'm not sure if I'm doing justice to this question, but I think, when we do spiritual bypass, it's when we try to leave the politics behind because we think we can't reconcile it. And I think that the way around that for me is to actually sit with the contradictions, and to sit with the political reality. Sometimes my yoga is going to a protest and expressing my anger at this unjust system, right? Sometimes my yoga is taking breaths with community, and sometimes it's seeking refuge in, my home practice. And I think when we can use our yoga to actually be in the world and confront suffering in the world, as opposed to escape the suffering of the world, that is the way to not necessarily participate in spiritual bypass. It's to recognize our positionality, right? For me, that's meant saying, I'm not just a victim as a South Asian woman who sees yoga commodified by Western white supremacy and colonial realities. I'm not just a victim of that, because my ancestors have participated and perpetuated harm and oppression as upper caste Hindus. And so how am I seeing my positionality and my own complicity in this system, right? Of and so if I were participating in spiritual bypass, I might just cry victim to this reality, as opposed to kind of saying, no, I have work to do as well, right? As someone who comes from a middle class um, or upper middle class background, and an upper caste background, and a Hindu background. I have work to do to confront Hindu fundamentalism. I have work to do to confront casteism, and all of us have work to do if we, reckon with our ancestry, if we reckon with our positionality in our society. And so I think it's kind of just recognizing we all have work to do in this deeply unfree world. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that. We all have work to do in this deeply unfree world that is kind of like that hits home. When you were
Mm,
speaking, I was really thinking about like the work that you've done with Yogis for Free Palestine, and I'm wondering if you can just speak a little bit about the space and coming into that and what's unfolded over the last really almost a year. Well, as we know, it was long before October 7th, but um, just speaking about, a lot of the listeners, there are some listeners potentially in the US, but I myself, I'm Canadian, so not far away. But for those that are listening, like it's kind of hard to get a sense of what the climate is like in the US right now. And, like you said, part of your yoga sometimes is going to a protest or being with community in that way. Like, how have you seen the climate, the group, the community come together, possibly in ways that are both difficult and heartbreaking, like we said before, in ways that are hopeful and uplifting and give us some kind of, you know, light to look towards, that this freedom movement, and similarly many other freedom movements, that there is hope, because it can be kind of so dire to just be kind of observing from a certain place. uh yeah, what's been your take on that?
yeah. Um, Struggling, if I'm honest, around the reach for hope. And at the same time, right, I'm reminded that Miriam Kaba says hope is a discipline. Um, uh, so yeah, Yogis for Palestine, um, it's both unfortunate and really important that Yogis for Palestine has to exist, right? Um, it was founded in June of 2021. As some of your listeners might be surprised, on the first, well, you know, Palestine has been occupied, uh, has like over, hundreds of years occupation history, right? Particularly by the Zionist entity since 1947, right? 1947, 1948. And um, in 2021, May 2021, we saw these Israel was kind of launching a bombardment on Gaza in May 2021. It was forcibly evacuating people from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem, which is, near the West Bank, not near Gaza. And I was part of protests then, and I came into Yogis for Palestine work, or I came into Palestine solidarity work, not necessarily as a yogi, but as someone who has always been part of abolitionist and anti-imperialist struggles, and had people in my circle who are willing to educate me on the history of the occupation of Palestine. And, I accompanied a friend, or went to go visit a friend in Palestine in 2019. And so I saw with my own eyes military apartheid. And I saw with my own eyes what a system of dehumanization does to the settler and to the people who are being occupied, right? All parties get dehumanized in that process. And and so when the Sheikh Jarrah uprisings kind of started occurring, and solidarity with those movements started occurring, a friend and I kind of got together and wrote our first solidarity statement in June 2021, and we published it on International Day of Yoga. in June 2021. And we called on other yogis to kind of say, like, how can we confront uh, the reality that, there's this way that International Day of Yoga in itself is a holiday that is weaponized for Hindu fundamentalism. It was created by Narendra Modi. But we want to use yoga to actually uplift the struggle for Palestinian liberation. And we want to show that our yoga can be in solidarity with the struggle to resist Israeli occupation. And so, we called on other yogis from around the world to sign on to this statement, and we got a lot of support. And then it was kind of like Yogis for Palestine kind of like went into hibernation. And and then in October, right, we hear about, these resistance efforts, right? We hear about the October 7th attacks, and then immediately, right, it's kind of like the world suddenly forgets history, right? They suddenly forget that there is a historical and a political context to that preceded what took place on October 7th, right? And uh and then you see all this like global sympathy with Israel, whereas like, up till October 7th, there had been a few hundred murders of Palestinian children, adults, right? Prior to that, there were numerous bombardments, right? And attacks. And this is after 75 years of dehumanization of the Palestinian people. And so it became clear that, watching yoga studios kind of also either remain complicit or neutral in this moment, that another friend and I had gotten together. This is someone who had taken a decolonizing yoga workshop with me. And we were like, we need to rewrite a new statement of solidarity. And and it's like at that time, I don't know if nobody knew that it was going to be 11 months in, that we were going to continue to witness the brutal massacre of beheaded children, by the Zionist entity, not necessarily the myths that they're spreading about what Hamas did, but it's like little did we know we were going to see that, but we just kind of continued to do the work of like, how can we hold a grieving space for Palestinians who are being dehumanized on the global sphere, in the mainstream? So how can we, in Philadelphia, kind of, there's a yoga studio that has always invited me to do decolonizing yoga workshops. It's called Studio 34. They opened up their space to host fundraiser yoga classes, and we started fundraising for Palestine Legal. We started fundraising for USCPR, which, is an organization that does Palestinian advocacy or rights, advocacy for Palestinian rights in the United States, and tries to stop, initiate an arms embargo on Israel, and is, trying to do the work of really ending this genocide that we're witnessing. And so we kind of were like trying to, build out a healing space for people who were doing the activist solidarity work, but then also, creating this fundraiser opportunity. And then it also became important to kind of think about how could we do political education work, right, through Yogis for Palestine. And so that's where we started doing the Omwashing and Zionism workshops, right, which actually take a critical look at how is it that Israel and the Zionist entity kind of use yoga as a form of propaganda to gain sympathy, right? And so we looked at the way in which they were doing yoga for the hostages, right? Without calling attention to the thousands of Palestinian hostages who have been held, by the Israeli occupation for years prior to October 7th, right? Um, and I think, and also how it is that, there's this contradiction within Israeli society. They have the highest number of yoga practitioners per capita, according to some statistics. And that to me is not commendable. That is, hypocritical and that is ironic, right? That this society that is deeply embedded in creating an ethno-supremacist state and a genocidal reality has the highest number of yoga practitioners per capita. And so Yogis for Palestine exists because it's a way to counter the status quo. As much as yogis may want to, to preach about the interconnected humanity that we all have, the unfortunate reality is because we as yoga practitioners exist in this environment that has deeply dehumanized all oppressed peoples, including Palestinians. The status quo of yoga practitioners is that they're going to side with Zionism, is that they're going to side with US imperialism, is that they're going to side with Hindu fundamentalism, because those are the groups in power. And so it takes active work to kind of say, no, Yogis for Palestine is going to do the work to resist imperialism. And that might seem contradictory, and that might seem like it's um I'm not sure what the word is, but it might seem, you know, like it's not holding sympathy, for um October 7th, but it's actually trying to kind of work against the status quo and humanize a population that has been dehumanized for hundreds of years. And so, and it calls on yogis to kind of say, like, how can we activate our yoga towards political action? And then how can we also use it, discernment to, critically engage and critically think about these yoga principles and
Mm-hmm.
living into them.
Mm-hmm. And then do you think that it's like also possible to hold the possibility, so whilst working to oppose imperialism, colonialism, these oppressive systems that we all exist within in some level of the spectrum, or like you said before, all of us recognizing our positionality of where we participate either actively or unconsciously in these oppressive systems, is there a possibility, or is there space even to hold the possibility that, say for example, like when we think about all the yoga practitioners in Israel, that there is possibility for opening or awakening or reconciliation within those people that are practicing yoga, or perhaps getting turned on to the philosophy of yoga in a way that doesn't uphold but rather starts to, from the inside out, break down these systems. Like, what about that?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be someone who believed in I'm somebody who believes in transformative possibilities and change, right? Evolution, I think, is a principle in nature. And so I do believe in anybody's capacity to change their mind, right? Or to um yeah, to just resist occupation in this capacity, right? Or in this particular situation and context. And so I do believe that the level of indoctrination that is present within um, Israeli society, right? You have at this moment, right, Zionists uh, basically justifying rape of Palestinian prisoners, right? We saw it on camera, and you have, mainstream members of Zionist society saying, like, yeah, that's how we need to treat these human animals, right? And so we see like the level of indoctrination. that exists. I don't necessarily think it's going to come from yoga philosophy per se, right? I think there are many different philosophies, but I think, yoga philosophy is also tainted, right? We haven't talked about it yet today, and I don't know if we will, right? But I think the reason why we hear Patanjali is this famous yoga philosopher, or the reason why we're told the Bhagavad Gita is a core yoga philosophy text is is not because those are the core yoga philosophy texts, right? But
Mm-hmm.
probably because they're groups in power historically that have said this is the text to read and this is the text that came out of that time period, right? And so, Prachi Patankar is this really brilliant Bahujana activist and, kind of writer. And she often talks about how, even Hinduism has appropriated yoga from tribal groups and from indigenous groups across India, right? And so I think that there are many philosophies that you could point to that have informed what we now call yoga philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or many cultural systems in a sense that also don't get credit for it. But I think the way we're going to get there is by listening to um, anti-imperial voices, right? If people within Israeli society are able to connect with uh, anti-imperial voices, if people who are yoga practitioners also, right, choose to engage these texts that are willing to engage with the liberatory politics and talk about abolitionism and talk about, ending these supremacist modes of um, existence and that are willing to engage with the political reality that we currently exist in. I think that is how, right? Not necessarily through yoga philosophy, although the practice, I think, can help us sit with the truths that are kind of revealed through the reading, right? It's like the yoga is there to kind of help us be like, ooh, all this unlearning, I'm getting sick from it, I'm getting dizzy from it. But it's also important because it's teaching me something. And my yoga teacher often said, he's like, if you're sick, then whatever's leaving your body is not just like physical illness, but it's also mental, like, stories and narratives that we've held to for so long, right? And in the US, we are fed propaganda for breakfast, lunch, and dinner on every mainstream media, right? And you asked earlier, like, what has it been like in the United States? And I'm like, every mainstream news channel, none of them are talking about the rape of Palestinians. None of them are actually telling us how many numbers of Palestinians have been murdered by our bombs, right? These are our tax dollars, and yet they're just peddling these lies and talking about, Kamala Harris has sympathy for Palestinians. Kamala Harris is still arming Israel, right? Kamala Harris is still committed to genocide, and none of these mainstream news channels are talking about it. And I think when we read and listen to independent news channels that are telling us the truth, yoga can help us kind of breathe into that and really just say, okay, where do we go from here? How do I course correct and how do I move forward in a more liberatory way? And it's not going to be pretty,
Mm-hmm.
but hopefully it'll free me.
Mm. Yeah, that's a beautiful kind of way to think about it in terms of like taking action in the now, using critical thinking and action in the world in the ways that we can, which I know I'll plug all the resources you have in the show notes for people that want to take action right now. I know that there's many ways that we can at least make efforts and do our part and use the practices of yoga and those somatic ways to allow ourselves to be able to face the discomfort and the dichotomy, like you said before, of a world that is deeply unfree. And I really feel like this time has gone by so fast. I
As
want
it
to
does.
finish by, I know, I want to finish by actually reading out another something that you wrote that I just like feels like sums up, obviously sums up your work, but sums up this discussion as well. So, you wrote, and I'm sorry, I don't have where I got pulled this from, but I will put it in the show notes. But you said, um, it was about the decol. It's your kind of framework for decolon the principles of decolonized yoga. So you said, and I will list them all. I'm sure you said in it, it's like non-exhaustive list, but in this writing there's about 20, and maybe you've expanded that to like more, I'm not sure, but you said we need to get honest about the diasporic fantasies of yoga's antiquated past so that we can dream into the future. I am ready to pour my radical imagination into birthing a liberatory and abolitionist framework for yoga. And then you list out all those principles, those decolonized yogic principles. And I won't read them all, but I'm just gonna like pop out a couple. Oh no, no, I closed it. Oh no, it's here, it's here. And like they're all like powerful. So just for the listeners so that they get inspired to go and read them all. A decolonized yoga honors the indigenous and heterogeneous cultures around the globe, including in ancient African civilizations that have contributed to yoga's evolution and preservation. A decolonized yoga understands the experiences of poverty, suffering, and oppression in the world to be generated by structures of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, casteism, neocolonialism, and imperialism, and contemplates how to eliminate suffering in the world by that aim to dismantle exploitive economic and social systems. I'll just read two more. A decolonized yoga recognizes yoga and our body, breath, and spirit as a gift from the universe greater than any nation, religion, ethnic, or social group. A decolonized yoga recognizes nature, the core elements of earth, water, air, and fire, and Mother Earth as the greatest all-time guru of spiritual liberation. Yeah, there's so many more good ones here. So I'm just gonna leave that and just put all of those in the show notes and all the links to your amazing work, your articles, a lot of your wonderful workshops you have. If you want to share any of your offerings, I know you have a lot going on. I wanted to ask you about your Yoga Warrior Tales program where you educate children on yoga mindfulness through a social justice lens. That seems really amazing. But before we do that, I just finished the episode up by asking 3 quick questions. So the first question is 3 words to describe your personal sadhana or practice.
Mm. Live into interconnectedness.
Live into interconnectedness. Beautiful.
Mm.
And any spiritual or otherwise text, scripture, book that inspires your practice?
Oh, wow. I know that there are many. I think one that I'm curious to explore right now. Oh no, Undrowned by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. It's Black feminist musings, an inspiration for marine mammals. It's just,
Okay,
yeah,
amazing.
it's a beautiful, beautiful book. And
Okay, I'm
so,
gonna check that out. I'm also gonna put that in the show notes. And then finally, sum up this conversation in one sentence.
oof, decolonize Palestine, free Palestine.
Beautiful. Awesome. So Just quickly, if the listeners want to find you, like I said, I'll put all your contacts in the notes, but any particular offerings or upcoming uh, ways to connect with you that they can check out?
Yeah. Um, for sure. Thank you so much for this conversation, Bobby. Uh, yeah, so you can find me at Sheena Shining, whether it's Sheena_Shining on Instagram. You can follow Yogis for Palestine on Instagram. And then I'm always doing decolonizing yoga workshops for yoga teacher training programs, 200 and 300-hour programs. And yeah, they can be in person, they can be virtual. Um, they kind of move people through, that ancestral work as well as that political work. And in it, I talk a little bit about Omwashing. And then with Yoga Warrior Tales, that's my kids' yoga program, right? So I like to say that my academic research is about uh, the weaponization of yoga and calling out the political weaponization of yoga. And so the kids' yoga offerings are my opportunity to anchor yoga in a liberatory potential, right? And so it's I'm about to reveal or kind of release season 1 of Yoga Warrior Tales, and it's these 7 recorded episodes that we did in front of a green screen where I fuse storytelling, like adventurous and interactive storytelling, with social justice parables in yoga. And it's kind of my way of teaching kids social justice values in an accessible way and in a mindful way. And so the season 1 episodes are about to be released. And so you can follow Yoga Warrior Tales on Instagram, or you can go to sheenasood.podia.com, which is where the course is going to be released. And soon to come, yogawarriortales.com. But yeah, so that's a
Amazing.
little.
Lots of good stuff there.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your time. You gave me so much on a personal level to think about and to take away and to really contemplate. Yeah, really a lot there. So I really am truly thankful. And I know that the listeners are going to take so much from this, and I know you're busy. So thank you for just being here and doing the work that you're doing. It's obviously so important, and what you represent and what you stand for. I'm just thankful I got to share a little bit of time with you.
Thank you, Bobby. Wish you well. I really appreciate your time and energy as well, and your thoughtful questions.
Great.
Have
Just
a good
gonna,
one.
yeah.